There was once a photograph that almost every American family owned, tucked carefully into the back pages of a family album, rarely shown to guests, and almost never discussed out loud. It wasn't a wedding photo. It wasn't a birthday. It was, in many cases, the only photograph a family would ever have of a loved one they had just lost. The man who took that photograph was, in his time, one of the most in-demand professionals in town. Not because the work was easy, because for many families, it was the only chance they would ever get to hold on to a face they were about to lose forever. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some of these photographs were crafted with such careful skill that even experts today still struggle to tell which person in the frame was alive and which one had already passed. The story begins in the early 1840s, just a few years after photography itself was invented. Before the camera, the only way to preserve someone's likeness after death was through a painted portrait, something only wealthy families could afford, and something that took days or weeks to complete. For most ordinary families, once a loved one was gone, there was often nothing left to remember their face by. No photograph, no painting, nothing but memory, which fades. The daguerreotype changed that almost overnight. For the first time, a lifelike image could be captured in minutes, not weeks, and at a price that many working families could stretch to afford, especially for an occasion they considered too important to skip. This practice fit into something much older, a tradition sometimes called memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning "remember that you will die." For centuries, art, jewelry, and even furniture had carried quiet reminders of mortality. Photography simply gave that old tradition a new, deeply personal form. Studios advertising this service often used gentler language in their storefront signs and newspaper notices. Phrases like last likeness or sacred portraiture, rather than anything more blunt. This wasn't an attempt to hide what the service was. It reflected how differently death itself was discussed and understood at the time, openly present in daily conversation rather than pushed to the margins the way it often is today. Here's something that's easy to forget today. In the mid-1800s, child mortality was devastatingly high. In some decades, it's estimated that as many as 1 in 5 children in America did not survive past their 5th birthday. For many families, especially those without much money, a portrait sitting simply never happened while the child was alive. There was no spare income for a photography studio visit and no sense of urgency, until, suddenly, there was. So, when a child passed away, grieving parents would sometimes make the difficult decision to call a photographer for the first, and only, photograph their son or daughter would ever have taken. It's a detail that's hard to sit with. For a heartbreaking number of families, the death photograph wasn't a strange or morbid choice. It was the only photograph that would ever exist. This wasn't limited to the poorest households either. Even middle-class families who could technically afford earlier portraits often simply never got around to it. Daily life was demanding. Studios were sometimes a long journey away, and no one imagined they were running out of time. Grief, in these cases, carried with it a second, quieter loss, the realization that there had never been a photograph taken at all, until now. Now let's rewind the technique itself, because what came next is where the story turns genuinely unsettling. This is where the story turns dark. Photographers of the era developed an entire set of techniques designed to make the deceased appear as lifelike as possible in the final image. Metal stands and hidden braces, originally designed to help living subjects hold perfectly still during long exposure times, were sometimes repurposed to prop a body into a natural, upright, seated position. In some documented cases, photographers or grieving family members would carefully paint pupils onto the closed eyelids in the finished print, or use small props to hold the eyes partially open, creating the unsettling illusion of a gaze looking back at the viewer. In certain portraits, especially those involving children, family members were photographed alongside the departed, sometimes standing directly behind them with a hand resting on their shoulder. appearing at first glance to be nothing more than an ordinary family portrait. It's only on closer inspection, historians note, that subtle signs reveal which person in the frame had already passed. A slightly unnatural stillness, eyes that don't quite focus, or a stand faintly visible behind the body. Some historians argue that these techniques were not born from anything sinister, but from something far more human, a desperate, tender wish to hold on to one final image that looked like life rather than loss. The long exposure times of early photography actually worked in the photographer's favor here, because living subjects already had to remain motionless for anywhere from several seconds to a full minute to avoid a blurred image. A photograph of someone who was naturally still didn't look unusual to audiences of the time in the way it might strike us today. What reads as eerie to modern eyes was, in its original context, simply a technical solution to a technical problem, one that happened to serve a deeply emotional purpose. For decades, this practice was woven quietly into everyday grief in America and much of Europe. Local photography studios openly advertised the service in their windows and newspaper listings, and it wasn't treated as taboo. It was simply understood as part of how a family said goodbye. These photographs were kept with enormous care. They were placed inside ornate frames, tucked into lockets worn close to the body, or preserved on the front pages of family Bibles, passed down through generations as some of a family's most treasured possessions. For families without another photograph of the person they'd lost, this image often became the emotional center of the entire household, displayed prominently, not hidden away, in a culture that understood mourning very differently than we do today. Some families even commissioned multiple prints of a single sitting, mailing copies to relatives who lived too far away to attend a funeral in person. In an era before telephones were common in most homes, a photograph like this sometimes served as the only way distant family members would ever see their lost relative's face one final time. A quiet, physical stand-in for a goodbye they couldn't otherwise share. By the early 1900s, several forces converged to change everything. Medical advances steadily brought child mortality rates down. Amateur cameras became affordable enough for ordinary families to own one at home, meaning most people now had photographs of loved ones taken while they were still very much alive. And cultural attitudes toward death itself began shifting. Grief moved from the front parlor of the home into the more private, professional space of the funeral home. By the mid-20th century, what had once been a completely normal, openly discussed family tradition had quietly become something people stopped mentioning altogether. The old photographs didn't disappear. Many families still have them today, tucked into attic boxes and inherited albums. But the practice of openly discussing them or commissioning new ones faded into near total silence. Today, many of these images survive primarily in museum archives and private historical collections, studied by researchers rather than displayed on mantelpieces. Modern viewers often encounter them for the first time with a sense of shock, unaware that, for the families who commissioned them, these were never meant to disturb. They were meant to comfort. It's worth sitting with the contrast for a moment. Today, we take thousands of photographs without a second thought, of coffee cups, sunsets, ordinary Tuesday afternoons, many of which we'll never look at again. For much of American history, families sometimes had exactly one photograph of someone they loved, and it captured the very last moment they had them at all. Perhaps the next time you scroll past an overflowing camera roll without a glance, it's worth remembering there was once a time when a single photograph carried the full weight of a family's grief and its love.